Money has always had a way of bending faith to its own purpose. And when we look at billionaires, this becomes even clearer. The richest people in the world often present themselves as deeply moral, guided by faith and supported by religious communities. Yet when you dig into the details, the beliefs they cling to and promote often serve one main purpose: protecting their power and wealth. Religion for them is less about spiritual comfort and more about control. It works as a shield, a justification, and sometimes even as a weapon. A billionaire might claim that their wealth is proof of divine blessing, that their rise to the top was not just about business strategies or ruthless decisions, but part of a divine plan. And this idea, repeated enough times, convinces not only themselves, but also millions of followers who then see inequality as natural, even sacred. Take the prosperity gospel. In the United States, it's the belief that wealth is a sign of God's favor and that poverty reflects some kind of moral failing or lack of faith. Many billionaires openly support churches and preachers who spread this message because it neatly excuses the system that made them rich. Instead of questioning why wealth is so unevenly distributed, followers are told that money flows to those who are righteous and faithful. It turns capitalism into theology, with billionaires as living proof of God's rewards. This belief system has devastating effects. It makes ordinary people blame themselves for financial hardship, thinking their struggles come from weak faith or insufficient prayer. At the same time, it elevates billionaires to almost godlike figures. If they have billions, then clearly they must be chosen, special, touched by divine approval. It's a cycle that strengthens inequality while keeping people passive, but it doesn't stop there. Many billionaires embrace or promote specific religious ideas that justify their control over others. The concept of stewardship, for example, sounds harmless. It suggests that the wealthy are caretakers of the resources of the earth. Yet in practice, it often means billionaires claiming a right to dominate industries, land, and even governments under the excuse that they are simply fulfilling God's will as stewards. The belief turns greed into duty and power into virtue. When religion is tied to wealth, it becomes a tool to sanctify exploitation. Think of how oil tycoons in deeply religious regions use faith to frame environmental destruction as part of God's plan for human dominion over nature, or how tech billionaires invoke biblical language about building the future as if innovation itself were sacred. These ideas may sound inspiring on the surface, but they serve to dull criticism. After all, how can you challenge something framed as holy? And then there are the darker, more controlling beliefs. Some billionaires funnel huge sums into religious institutions that push for laws restricting women's rights, LGBTQ rights, or scientific education. They call it defending tradition or morality, but really it's about shaping society in a way that keeps their influence secure. By financing certain churches or religious groups, they're not just expressing personal faith, they're buying moral authority, reshaping the public imagination so that their power feels untouchable. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible it often is. When a billionaire donates hundreds of millions to a religious university or a megachurch network, it looks like charity. But those donations come with strings. They shape curricula, they guide what is preached, they set boundaries for what people are allowed to question. And slowly, religious beliefs that protect extreme inequality are seeded deep into culture. It's important to notice how these beliefs are not accidental. They are carefully chosen, shaped, and promoted because they reinforce the billionaire's position. Religion provides a framework where questioning authority can be cast as sinful and wealth can be sanctified. This is not just about private belief. It's about a system that gives billionaires moral cover. Take the idea of predestination in certain Christian traditions. The claim that some people are destined by God for greatness and others for struggle. For billionaires, this belief is almost tailor-made. It tells people that the wealth gap is not only natural but divinely arranged. If you're poor, you're meant to be. If you're rich, you're fulfilling God's eternal plan. It removes responsibility from the powerful and turns social injustice into sacred inevitability. This same kind of thinking appears in different forms across the world. In some regions, billionaires sponsor religious schools that teach children to accept authority as God-given. Questioning leadership becomes not just rebellion, but sin. In others, they fund groups that preach obedience, patience, and sacrifice, not from the wealthy, but from the working poor. The result is a society where the powerful are beyond accountability, shielded by theology. We can also look at the way billionaires manipulate religious charities. On the surface, they appear generous, building hospitals, schools, or churches, but the generosity often masks tax avoidance or influence building. When a billionaire gives a fortune to a faith-based foundation, it's not just about doing good, it's about ensuring that the moral authority of religion is tied directly to their name and legacy. The charity becomes a monument, a spiritual fortress protecting their reputation. And then there are the billionaires who actively exploit apocalyptic beliefs. Some religious traditions thrive on the idea that the world is ending soon, that suffering and inequality are simply signs of prophecy. Billionaires who support these groups find it easier to excuse environmental collapse or social decline. If the end is near, why worry about justice? Why bother with climate action? The faithful are told not to resist, but to wait for divine rescue. And while they wait, the billionaires profit. The pattern becomes clear when you compare across different contexts, whether it's the prosperity gospel in America, conservative Catholic movements in Europe, or fundamentalist networks in the Middle East. Billionaires latch onto whichever religious ideas best serve their interests, and it's not about devotion, it's about strategy. Religion provides the perfect language for dressing up exploitation as destiny, charity, or morality. What's even more troubling is how these beliefs are absorbed by ordinary people. When a billionaire funds a preacher, a seminary, or a media empire, the ideas spread far beyond the boardroom. They filter into classrooms, television shows, and even political campaigns. Slowly, people come to see inequality, control, and exploitation not as problems, but as divine order. Billionaires don't need to preach directly. They let religion do it for them. And there's a psychological dimension here too. For someone struggling at the bottom of the economic ladder, it can feel comforting to believe that the rich are chosen by God. That one day, with enough faith and obedience, maybe they too will rise. This lottery of blessing keeps people clinging to the very systems that oppress them. They don't rebel because they think their suffering is part of a holy story. And the billionaires sit back, protected by beliefs they may not even hold sincerely. This raises the question of sincerity. Do billionaires really believe these doctrines, or do they simply use them? In truth, it doesn't matter much. Whether they genuinely think their wealth is divinely blessed, or they cynically push that narrative, the outcome is the same. Religion becomes a weapon that shields them from criticism and gives their power a sacred glow. There's also the question of how these beliefs bleed into politics. Billionaires rarely stay in their business lanes. They fund campaigns, lobby lawmakers, and shape public policy. And their religious commitments, whether real or performative, become part of that influence. When a billionaire pours money into religious political movements, they aren't just defending their faith. They're embedding their wealth in the very laws that govern society. Take restrictions on reproductive rights. Many of the wealthiest donors behind anti-abortion movements claim religious motivation. But beyond morality, these laws create a culture of control. They reduce personal freedom, especially for women, while strengthening the influence of conservative institutions that billionaires themselves support. It's not simply about belief in a soul or a divine commandment. It's about ensuring that society bends toward obedience and tradition rather than equality and change. Another clear example is education. Billionaires fund private religious schools and universities, often shaping curricula to align with their views. Creationism sneaks into science classrooms. History is retold to favor religious dominance. Students graduate with a worldview that justifies hierarchy, obedience, and inequality. These schools don't just create workers, they create believers in a system where the rich are always right and questioning them is dangerous. Some billionaires even take it further, supporting groups that oppose scientific research, climate denial, anti-vaccine rhetoric, rejection of evolution, all find financial backing from wealthy figures with religious justifications. The message is clear: faith should override evidence. And when society is taught to ignore facts in favor of belief, billionaires benefit. Science often exposes the costs of their industries: pollution, exploitation, destruction of resources. By undermining science with religious narratives, they protect their profits. The use of religion also allows billionaires to appear humble and relatable. Instead of being seen as untouchable elites, they present themselves as just another believer. They attend church, quote scripture, donate to religious charities. This image softens their wealth, cloaking ruthless business practices in the language of faith. It's a strategy that keeps them close to ordinary people while ensuring those same people will never question their fortune. And then there are the extreme cases where billionaires support fringe religious movements. These groups often thrive on fear: fear of outsiders, fear of modernity, fear of freedom. Billionaires channel money into them because fear creates loyalty. A frightened population looks for saviors, and if religious leaders point to billionaires as divinely favored protectors, their power grows even stronger. What looks like generosity is really investment and control. One of the most chilling aspects is how billionaires use religion to shape not only laws and culture, but also global policy. Wealthy philanthropists with religious agendas fund international projects that dictate how aid is distributed, what health programs are supported, and what cultural values are promoted abroad. In some cases, life-saving programs like contraception distribution are blocked because they conflict with religious beliefs of the donors. Entire populations suffer so that billionaires can maintain their moral image. This global reach shows how deeply religion and wealth intertwine. A billionaire in one country can shape the health, education, and freedoms of people halfway around the world, all under the banner of faith. And because it's framed as charity, most people never question it. The narrative is always the same. The wealthy are acting out of kindness, guided by God. Few stop to ask how much suffering is caused by their selective generosity. What emerges is a pattern where religion becomes less about personal conviction and more about infrastructure. It's a network of churches, schools, charities, and political movements all tied together with money. And at the top, billionaires pull the strings. Whether they actually believe or not, they understand one truth: faith keeps people in line. It makes inequality appear righteous, and it silences those who might otherwise resist. The psychology behind all this is as important as the politics. Human beings are wired to seek meaning, to want explanations for why things are the way they are. Religion has always offered those explanations, and billionaires understand this better than anyone. If people see wealth as random or unfair, resentment builds. But if wealth can be explained as part of a divine plan, resentment turns into acceptance, and it's not just economics, it's psychology harnessed for power. Consider the way many billionaires present their stories as they talk about starting from nothing, about working hard, about staying faithful, even if the reality is far more complicated: inheritance, privilege, exploitation. The story is what matters. It mirrors biblical tales of chosen figures rising through faith and perseverance. People don't see ruthless business tactics. They see a modern parable, a morality tale where success equals virtue. This storytelling is incredibly effective. It makes the billionaire's fortune feel deserved, even holy. This narrative also feeds into something sociologists call system justification. People want to believe the world is fair. They want to think the system they live under makes sense. Religion gives billionaires the language to reinforce that illusion. If you're poor, it's part of God's test. If you're rich, it's God's reward. And suddenly, inequality feels less like injustice and more like cosmic order. People don't fight back against order, they adjust to it. The problem is, that this psychological comfort comes at a terrible cost. Instead of channeling frustration into change, people are told to wait, to pray, to trust. Billionaires thrive in that passivity. Every time a preacher says, "Your reward is in the next life," the billionaire breathes easier, because it means the masses won't demand their reward here and now. It's also worth pointing out how billionaires use guilt as a tool. In many religions, questioning authority or wealth is seen as envy, as sin. To even feel anger at injustice is reframed as moral weakness. This keeps people silent, ashamed of their own instincts for fairness. Meanwhile, billionaires are painted as virtuous, generous, godly. The very instinct to rebel is strangled before it can grow. And then there's the way billionaires align themselves with divine punishment. In some traditions, disasters, poverty, or illness are seen as consequences of disobedience to God. When billionaires pour money into these beliefs, they create a culture where suffering is always the victim's fault. Lost your job? Maybe you lacked faith? Can't pay the bills? Maybe you sinned. It's a worldview that absolves the powerful of any responsibility. This is where religion becomes more than just a shield. It becomes a weapon. A billionaire who funds religious groups that preach obedience is not just protecting themselves. They're actively disarming resistance. They're teaching people to see their own exploitation as sacred duty. The system doesn't just go unchallenged, it becomes holy. At the same time, billionaires enjoy the personal comfort of these beliefs. Convincing yourself that your fortune is God's will makes it easier to ignore the suffering your wealth accumulation caused. It soothes the conscience. It allows billionaires to see themselves as benevolent leaders instead of ruthless profiteers. They can sleep at night, not because they are innocent, but because they have baptized their guilt in religion. What makes this all the more insidious is the way these beliefs are dressed up in the language of kindness. Billionaires speak of giving back, of being blessed to bless others, but what they give back is always far less than what they took. And what they bless others with is not freedom or justice, but dependence and obedience. They present themselves as saviors, but only within a system that keeps them at the top. When you peel back the layers, the evil in these religious beliefs isn't always in the doctrines themselves. It's in how those doctrines are weaponized by people with immense power. It's in how faith is twisted into a tool for control, for silence, for obedience. Billionaires may not invent these beliefs, but they refine them, amplify them, and distribute them through money and influence. And the result is a world where inequality is not only tolerated, but worshipped. Looking at real examples makes the pattern impossible to ignore. In the United States, some of the biggest fortunes have poured into churches that preach the prosperity gospel. Wealthy oil and real estate families fund televangelists who tell millions of viewers that God wants them to be rich. These sermons don't just encourage personal ambition, they redefine greed as faith. Every dollar given to the church is framed as planting a seed for future blessing. And who benefits most from this cycle? The preachers, the churches, and the billionaire backers who secure political loyalty through it. Consider the Koch brothers, who spent billions shaping conservative religious networks. Their donations supported institutions that opposed environmental regulation, promoted traditional family values, and blocked labor protections. Religion became the language through which corporate interests were dressed up as moral imperatives. Protecting fossil fuels wasn't about profit, it was about God's gift of dominion over the earth. Weakening unions wasn't about corporate control. It was about defending the natural order of work and authority. By couching policies in faith, they transformed self-interest into holiness. In Silicon Valley, the story looks different but follows the same logic. Tech billionaires may not sponsor megachurches, but many weave spiritual or quasi-religious language into their empires. Ideas about transcendence, immortality, and salvation through technology echo religious promises. Some openly fund movements that treat technology itself as a path to godhood. It sounds futuristic, but at its core, it's the same manipulation, using faith, this time in machines, instead of deities, to justify vast inequalities of power. If you question their control, you're not just doubting a company, you're doubting the future itself. Then there are billionaires who align with hardline religious nationalism. In countries where religion and state are tightly bound, the wealthy play a major role in financing movements that fuse divine authority with political power. By supporting parties or leaders who claim to represent God's will, they lock in systems that protect their wealth while suppressing dissent. Religion here is less about saving souls and more about securing empires. Even philanthropy follows this pattern. Take a billionaire who builds religious hospitals that refuse to provide contraception or religious schools that teach obedience over inquiry. On the surface, it looks like generosity, but the generosity comes with limits that reinforce the billionaire's moral vision. Health, education, and welfare are reshaped to fit religious dogma, and people who depend on those services are forced to live within those boundaries. Charity becomes a form of control. In many parts of the world, billionaires are deeply tied to religious movements that oppose modern freedoms. They fund campaigns against LGBTQ rights, against gender equality, against scientific progress, always under the banner of defending faith. But the outcome is the same, a society where questioning traditional structures becomes dangerous. And those structures always protect the wealth and power of the elite. The global dimension is just as striking. American billionaires, for example, have spent enormous sums funding religious campaigns in Africa and Latin America. They sponsor groups that oppose reproductive rights, promote abstinence-only education, and block LGBTQ protections. The result, entire governments shifting policy not because of local democratic choice, but because of foreign billionaires funding religious propaganda. Religion becomes an export product shipped overseas to mold societies in ways that reflect billionaire interests. This is where the evil becomes undeniable. These aren't just personal beliefs held quietly in private lives. They are deliberate investments in systems of control. Billionaires weaponize religion to dictate laws, influence culture, and rewrite morality itself. And because the packaging is spiritual, many people never see the manipulation happening. They think they're following God when in reality they're following the money. What's most disturbing is how normalized this has become. People expect billionaires to have their charities, their foundations, their religious affiliations. It all looks like part of the natural order of things. But behind the glossy speeches and grand donations is a calculated effort to tie faith and wealth together so tightly that neither can be questioned. Criticize the billionaire and you're accused of blasphemy. Challenge inequality and you're told you're rebelling against God's will. The hidden mechanisms are where the system becomes most effective. On the surface, billionaires seem like they're just giving money away, but the structures they build ensure that every dollar works in their favor. One of the most important tools is the religious foundation. These organizations are registered as charities, meaning they receive massive tax breaks. Instead of paying into the public system that could fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, billionaires funnel money into religious institutions that reinforce their worldview. It's a clever way of turning taxation into indoctrination. Through these foundations, billionaires shape what kinds of research get funded, what schools teach, and what charities thrive. A billionaire doesn't have to openly declare war on public education or secular science. They simply make sure that their donations only support religious schools and universities that teach creationism, obedience, or faith-based economics. Over time, the intellectual landscape tilts in their direction, and nobody notices how deliberate the shift has been. Faith-based lobbying is another crucial channel. Religious lobbying groups often appear as grassroots movements, concerned parents, moral citizens, communities of faith, but behind them are billionaires paying the bills. They bankroll campaigns that pressure politicians to adopt religiously flavored laws. From restrictions on reproductive rights to limits on scientific research, these laws rarely benefit ordinary believers. They benefit the wealthy by keeping society focused on obedience, morality policing, and distraction instead of film inequality. Religious media is perhaps the most powerful weapon. Televangelism, radio ministries, online platforms, many of these are sustained by billionaire funding. The content is crafted to preach faith in God while subtly reinforcing faith in wealth and hierarchy. Audiences tune in for spiritual comfort and leave with a worldview that excuses billionaires as divinely chosen figures. The messaging doesn't need to be explicit. Simply showing billionaires alongside pastors or praising them as generous donors is enough to make wealth look sacred. And then there's the role of political theater. Billionaires make a point of being seen in churches, praying publicly, quoting scripture at rallies. These gestures are not casual. They're rehearsed, calculated, and designed to signal loyalty to religious communities. The image works both ways. The billionaire gains moral credibility, and the religious institution gains financial backing. Together, they form a cycle of mutual reinforcement that blurs the line between faith and fortune. What's striking is how much of this goes unnoticed because it's wrapped in the language of tradition. Nobody questions a billionaire building a cathedral wing or donating to a seminary. It looks like generosity, culture, heritage. But when those donations dictate what sermons are preached, what students are taught, and what laws are passed, it stops being tradition and becomes manipulation. And the scale is enormous, but the mechanics are subtle enough that most people never connect the dots. Even tax loopholes themselves are often justified through religion. Billionaires argue that because they're giving back through faith-based charities, they shouldn't be burdened with heavy taxes. But the reality is that their donations don't replace public services, they distort them. Instead of universal health care, we get hospitals that deny basic reproductive care. Instead of comprehensive education, we get schools that suppress science. Instead of independent media, we get networks that preach obedience. The billionaire's religion becomes the framework within which society itself is allowed to function. This control extends to politics in even more direct ways. Some billionaires fund entire political parties that wrap themselves in religious imagery. Campaigns are filled with scripture, promises to restore godly values, and appeals to morality. Yet the policies that follow are almost always tilted toward protecting corporate wealth, weakening worker rights, and concentrating power. Religion is simply the banner under which economic domination marches. And then there's the international dimension again. Religious NGOs funded by billionaires often operate abroad, where they wield enormous influence over fragile governments. They tie foreign aid to religious conditions, demanding that local policies conform to the billionaire's faith agenda. This can mean blocking contraception programs during health crises, censoring education in developing nations, or even fueling intolerance that leads to violence. The billionaire isn't just shaping their own country's culture, they're reshaping the moral order of entire regions. It becomes hard to tell where religion ends and power begins. For billionaires, they are one and the same. The pulpit becomes an extension of the boardroom. The congregation becomes a captive audience. And faith itself is redefined not as a search for meaning, but as a tool for obedience, loyalty, and submission to wealth. Another layer to this manipulation is the way billionaires cultivate myths about themselves. They aren't satisfied with being wealthy. They want to be seen as chosen, almost sacred. Religion gives them the perfect stage to build that image. Through donations, speeches, and partnerships with the religious leaders, they create narratives where their personal success isn't just luck or exploitation, it's destiny. Think of how many billionaires frame their lives as rags to riches stories with divine undertones. Even when their rise was built on inherited wealth, monopolistic tactics, or crushing competition, they present it as the hand of God guiding them. They talk about being blessed or walking in faith. Their fortunes become parables, lessons for the faithful. And once that narrative takes root, challenging their power feels like questioning a sacred story. Some go further, adopting outright messianic imagery. They aren't just successful, they are saviors. They talk about redeeming society, healing the world, building God's kingdom on earth. Their business ventures are described not as profit-driven, but as missions. A new product isn't just innovation, it's liberation. A donation isn't just charity, it's salvation. Slowly, the billionaire stops being seen as a mere human and becomes a vessel of divine purpose. This myth-making is especially effective when tied to global crises. During pandemics, famines, or wars, billionaires step forward with religiously tinged language about sacrifice and salvation. They donate money, fund programs, give speeches, and while their aid may provide real relief, it also elevates them to a role far beyond business. They become the heroes of history, the modern saints. People forget to ask how much of the crisis was made worse by the very systems those billionaires built. Religious leaders often play into this mythology. When pastors or priests publicly thank billionaires for their generosity, they frame them as God's instruments. Entire congregations are told to see the billionaire as part of God's plan. Sometimes sermons explicitly compare them to biblical figures: Solomon for wisdom, Job for perseverance, even Moses for leadership. The billionaire's image merges with Scripture, and faith itself becomes tied to loyalty toward the wealthy. This myth-making also happens through architecture and naming rights. Billionaires donate vast sums to build churches, universities, and hospitals with their names carved into stone. These buildings aren't just structures. They are monuments to the billionaire's supposed holiness. Walking into them, worshipers and students are reminded that their education, their healing, even their worship depends on the generosity of one wealthy benefactor. It creates a permanent bond between faith and fortune. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this savior narrative is how it discourages collective action. If the billionaire is framed as a messiah, then ordinary people are cast as passive followers. They are told to trust, to wait, to obey. Change doesn't come from the ground up. It comes from the top down, from the chosen few who hold wealth and power. This is the exact opposite of democracy. Instead of questioning leaders, people worship them. Instead of building solidarity, they rely on saviors. And the billionaires thrive in this environment. They don't have to answer hard questions about exploitation, inequality, or injustice, because they've built a story where every criticism looks like ingratitude. Every challenge looks like rebellion against God's plan. They can hoard wealth, shape laws, and even undermine freedoms while still being praised as holy figures. This isn't just manipulation, it's myth-making at the scale of civilization. Billionaires are writing themselves into the sacred stories of our time. They are positioning themselves not just as business leaders, but as prophets, priests, and messiahs of a new age. And once those myths are in place, breaking them becomes incredibly difficult. People don't just lose faith in billionaires, they feel like they're losing faith itself. Apocalyptic beliefs are one of the most powerful tools billionaires can attach themselves to. Across many religions, the idea of an approaching end of the world creates urgency, fear, and loyalty. People who think they're living in the final days become desperate for leaders who can guide them, protect them, and offer hope. Billionaires, with their resources and influence, step neatly into that role. Some finance entire movements built on end times prophecy. They fund preachers who say wars, natural disasters, or pandemics are proof that the final battle between good and evil is near. And when people accept this story, inequality, corruption, and exploitation stop being political problems. They're reinterpreted as signs of prophecy. If the world is ending anyway, why bother fighting for justice? That paralysis serves the billionaire perfectly. They keep extracting wealth while the faithful wait for divine rescue. Apocalyptic thinking also gives billionaires a way to brand themselves as defenders of civilization, and in times of crisis, they present their businesses as essential to survival. The food tycoon talks about feeding the world through divine calling. The weapons magnate claims they're protecting the faithful against evil forces. The tech billionaire frames their work on space travel or artificial intelligence as humanity's only hope for salvation. Suddenly, their projects aren't just profitable, they're sacred missions. This narrative also shields them from criticism. If someone challenges the billionaire's empire, it's painted as sabotage in the cosmic war. Opponents aren't just critics, they're enemies of God's plan. And this thinking filters down to ordinary believers who defend billionaires fiercely, not because they understand economics or politics, but because they believe they're defending the side of good in a holy battle. Billionaires become untouchable, wrapped in the armor of prophecy. The irony is that many billionaires themselves invest in very practical doomsday preparations, use secret bunkers, survival compounds, luxury shelters stocked with supplies. They talk publicly about divine destiny while privately preparing to escape the consequences of their own systems. Religion gives them the stage to look like saviors, while their wealth gives them the tools to abandon everyone else when disaster strikes. There's also a subtler connection. Apocalyptic beliefs justify the destruction billionaires cause. If the end is near, then why worry about pollution, climate collapse, or inequality? These aren't problems to solve. They're proof of prophecy. Billionaires who profit from industries that harm the planet benefit enormously from this mindset. Every drought, fire, or storm isn't corporate negligence. It's divine will. And people who could demand change are told instead to pray and prepare. The most sinister aspect of all is how apocalyptic beliefs can be weaponized politically. Billionaires fund leaders who promise to defend God's people in the final battle. Policies become less about governance and more about cosmic war. Wars are justified as divine necessity. Injustice is ignored as a sign of prophecy. And billionaires keep pouring money into the machine because chaos and fear guarantee loyalty. The result is a dangerous mix. Billionaires at the top, apocalyptic religion at the base, and between them a vast population too frightened or too loyal to resist. It creates a society where the present doesn't matter, where accountability disappears, and where power concentrates into fewer and fewer hands. The faithful wait for an end that never comes, while billionaires live comfortably in the meantime. And this reveals the core evil in these religious beliefs. They don't just excuse inequality, they lock people into a future where inequality is permanent, even sacred. The billionaire isn't just rich, they're chosen, blessed, even a protector in the cosmic struggle. And once someone holds that kind of role in the public imagination, almost no amount of evidence can bring them down. The damage from these billionaire-backed beliefs shows up most clearly in everyday life. Families, communities, and even personal morality get reshaped in ways that quietly reinforce billionaire power. It doesn't always look dramatic. It often feels ordinary, even natural. But the effects run deep. Take family life. Religious doctrines funded and amplified by billionaire donations often preach rigid hierarchies in the home. Husbands as unquestioned heads, wives as obedient partners, children as submissive followers. At first glance, this might look like tradition or morality, but it's actually a mirror of the same hierarchy billionaires rely on in society. Unquestioned authority at the top, obedience at the bottom. When people are trained from childhood to see authority as sacred in their own homes, they are less likely to resist it in politics or economics. In communities, the same logic applies. Churches or mosques or temples backed by billionaire money become centers of loyalty and conformity. Leaders preach that obedience to faith is the highest virtue. They warn against questioning too much, against rebelling, against doubting. But beneath the sermons, what's really being reinforced is the idea that power deserves obedience. Communities become disciplined, not free, and billionaires smile, knowing those communities will never challenge the system that made them rich. Even personal morality gets bent in this direction, and billionaire-backed religion often frames sin in highly selective ways. Greed, exploitation, and hoarding wealth rarely get emphasized. Instead, focus is put on personal behavior, sexuality, gender roles, private choices. People grow up believing that morality is about controlling themselves, not questioning structures. And so long as they don't cross those private boundaries, billionaires are free to act as they please without being seen as immoral. This reshaping of morality also isolates people from each other. When communities are told to judge each other's personal lives, they stop uniting against bigger problems. Neighbors argue over who is living morally instead of coming together to resist injustice. The billionaire doesn't need to divide them directly. The religious framework does it automatically. By defining sin narrowly and strategically, billionaires ensure that the spotlight never shines on their own actions. Education is another everyday space where these beliefs do harm. Billionaire-funded religious schools often teach obedience over inquiry. They discourage critical thinking and replace scientific explanations with dogma. Students may graduate without understanding evolution, climate science, or even basic history. Instead, they carry with them a worldview where authority and faith matter more than evidence. These students grow into adults who don't challenge the billionaires because they were never trained to ask hard questions in the first place. Workplaces are also influenced. Billionaire-backed religious teachings about servant leadership or calling are often used to mask exploitation. Workers are told their jobs are a mission, their labor is service to God, their sacrifices are noble. It turns underpayment and overwork into spiritual tests instead of economic injustice. A worker who complains can be framed not as a victim of exploitation, but as someone failing their moral duty. Even suffering itself gets reframed. Instead of seeing a hardship as something to resist or fix, people are told to accept it as part of God's plan. Illness, poverty, unemployment, these are interpreted as spiritual challenges, not systemic failures. And while people wait for divine relief, billionaires keep profiting from the very systems that create those hardships, and the faith becomes a cushion that softens pain but also prevents resistance. All of this adds up to a society where obedience, submission, and passivity are baked into everyday life. From the family dinner table to the classroom, from the workplace to the voting booth, the same message echoes. Don't question, don't rebel, don't fight. Authority is sacred, wealth is divine, and your role is to endure. It's a message that keeps billions of people quiet while billionaires tighten their grip. And perhaps the most disturbing part is how invisible this process feels. Most people don't think about billionaires when they pray or when they send their kids to school or when they go to work. They think they're following faith, but faith in these contexts has already been rewritten by billionaire money. The beliefs people hold in their hearts are not always organic. They're curated, financed, and reinforced by the very elites those beliefs protect. Culture is one of the most powerful spaces where billionaire-driven religion does its work. Unlike politics or education, where the influence can be obvious, culture works more subtly. It shapes how people feel, what they celebrate, and what they aspire to. And billionaires understand that if they can embed their religious worldview into culture, they don't just win people's obedience, they win their imagination. Look at art. Throughout history, wealthy patrons have funded religious art to glorify both faith and themselves. In the modern world, billionaires sponsor religious films, museums, and cultural events that reinforce a certain moral framework. These projects may look like harmless storytelling, but they quietly normalize the idea that wealth and holiness belong together. The billionaire who funds the cathedral or the movie about biblical heroes is written into the cultural memory as a benefactor of both art and faith. In media, the effect is even stronger. Religious television networks, radio shows, streaming platforms, and online channels often survive because of billionaire donations. The content they produce does more than preach scripture. It embeds economic and political messages. A sermon about obedience doubles as a lesson in accepting inequality. A faith-based news channel frames billionaire donors as moral leaders. Over time, viewers stop separating wealth from virtue. Billionaires become cultural icons not because of their business acumen, but because of their supposed moral authority. Entertainment is another crucial front. Billionaire-backed religious film studios churn out movies where faith conquers doubt, obedience is rewarded, and rebellion leads to ruin. These stories feel personal, emotional, and inspiring, but they also reinforce the same themes billionaires depend on. Trust authority, accept inequality, wait for divine justice instead of demanding earthly fairness. People leave the theater feeling uplifted, but also quietly more willing to accept the very systems that exploit them. Music, too, plays a role. Mega concerts and worship festivals often receive funding from wealthy donors. The lyrics may speak of surrender, blessing, or divine favor. But behind the music is a financial structure that ties faith to corporate wealth. The audience doesn't just experience worship, they experience billionaire-funded worship. And without realizing it, they associate the emotional high of faith with the invisible presence of wealth sustaining the event. Even fashion and lifestyle trends get shaped by this dynamic. Billionaires fund influencers who promote religious modesty, family values, or prosperity aesthetics. These messages seem personal, but they normalize the idea that true virtue lies in fitting into roles defined by billionaire-backed religion. The way people dress, speak, or spend money ends up echoing values designed to keep wealth and authority in the hands of the few. And then there's the cultural silence. Billionaire influence ensures that certain critiques rarely appear in mainstream media. Movies that challenge religious authority struggle to find funding. Musicians who question faith-based hierarchies are sidelined. Journalists who investigate religious billionaires face backlash. The culture doesn't just promote certain values, it suppresses alternatives. Billionaire money decides what counts as family-friendly, moral, or sacred, and anything that falls outside those categories gets erased. The long-term effect is that inequality doesn't just exist in laws or schools, it becomes part of the cultural air people breathe. Stories, songs, films, and festivals all whisper the same message. Wealth is holy, authority is sacred, obedience is good. People grow up surrounded by these messages without ever realizing who paid for them. They believe they are absorbing culture, but in reality, they are absorbing billionaire theology. What makes this cultural influence so powerful is that it feels voluntary. Nobody is forcing someone to watch a religious movie or attend a faith-based concert, but when culture saturates the landscape, choice becomes illusion. Everywhere you turn, the stories repeat the same ideas. The billionaires' beliefs aren't presented as propaganda. They're presented as entertainment, inspiration, even beauty. And that makes them even harder to resist. Culture has always been a battleground for ideas, but in the hands of billionaires, it becomes less of a battle and more of a monopoly. They don't need to argue with competing visions of morality because they can outspend them. With enough money, they can flood the cultural sphere with their version of faith until it feels like the only version that exists. Politics is where billionaire-shaped religion shows its most obvious impact. Presidents, prime ministers, and lawmakers often carry the language of faith into their speeches, policies, and campaigns, but behind much of that religious rhetoric is money, billionaire money that guides not just what is said, but what is believed to be politically possible. Campaigns cost enormous sums. Politicians rely on donors to survive. And when those donors are billionaires with strong religious agendas, politics bends in predictable ways. A candidate who receives money from a religious billionaire doesn't just promise economic policies, they promise to restore morality, defend faith, or protect the family. These phrases sound like cultural values, but they are carefully chosen signals that billionaire-backed religious agendas will be enforced in law. This influence goes far beyond symbolic gestures. In the United States, for example, Supreme Court appointments are shaped by billionaire-funded religious lobbying. Judges who oppose reproductive rights, LGBTQ equality, or secular education are elevated not because of their legal expertise, but because they align with a religious vision funded by billionaires. The rulings that follow reshape society for decades, often in ways that serve the interests of the wealthy. In other countries, the same pattern emerges with different flavors. Oligarchs in Russia tie themselves to the Orthodox Church, using religious nationalism to legitimize their political and economic dominance. Billionaires in India fund Hindu nationalist movements that fuse religion with corporate interests. Wealthy elites in the Middle East tie their fortunes to conservative interpretations of Islam that suppress dissent and preserve hierarchy. Everywhere you look, religion becomes the glue that holds billionaire power to political authority. The danger is that once politics is wrapped in religion, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge. Opposing a law isn't just seen as political dissent. It's framed as an attack on God's will. Billionaire-backed faith movements paint their policies as divine, making resistance feel like rebellion against the sacred This blurs the line between church and state until the two are indistinguishable, and billionaires sit comfortably at the intersection, pulling strings from both sides. Lobbying itself becomes a kind of priesthood. Religious organizations funded by billionaires act as intermediaries between politicians and the public. They claim to speak for the people of faith, but in reality, they speak for the billionaires who pay their bills. Politicians listen, not because they fear God, but because they fear losing financial backing. And the public, convinced these organizations represent their beliefs, cheer for policies that ultimately protect the wealthy. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Billionaires fund religious institutions that influence voters. Those voters elect politicians who depend on billionaire money, and those politicians pass laws that protect billionaire wealth. At every stage, religion acts as a moral cover, turning raw self-interest into sacred duty. The international reach of this system is staggering. Billionaire-funded religious groups lobby not only their own governments, but also international organizations. They push for policies at the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and other global institutions as they demand restrictions on reproductive health aid, promote abstinence-only education, and block progressive resolutions. And these decisions affect millions of lives around the world, all shaped by religious agendas tied to billionaire fortunes. And when politicians themselves are billionaires, the fusion becomes complete. Leaders who hold immense personal wealth often use religion as a personal brand. They frame themselves as chosen, as defenders of the faith, as protectors of morality. Their political platforms blend corporate self-interest with religious authority, creating systems where questioning them feels not only unpatriotic but blasphemous. This is why billionaire-shaped religion in politics is so dangerous. It doesn't just influence one policy or one election, it rewires the very foundation of governance. Laws stop being debated on their merits and start being judged by whether they align with billionaire-backed faith narratives. Constitutions become secondary to scripture. Democracy itself gets reshaped not by the people, but by the wealthy few who have the money to redefine morality at scale. Global crises reveal just how destructive billionaire-driven religion can be. When the world faces problems that demand cooperation, reason, and long-term planning, the religious agendas of billionaires often push in the opposite direction. They don't just fail to solve crises, they actively make them worse. Take climate change. The science is clear, yet some of the wealthiest individuals in the world fund religious narratives that downplay or outright deny it. They push the belief that humans were given dominion over the earth, that exploiting resources is not just acceptable but divinely ordained. Others emphasize apocalyptic theology, framing environmental disasters as signs of prophecy instead of consequences of human action. In both cases, the outcome is the same: inaction. Billionaires keep profiting from fossil fuels, deforestation, and pollution, while religious followers are told to trust in God's plan rather than demand accountability. Poverty is another area where billionaire-backed religion distorts reality. Instead of addressing inequality as a structural problem, faith networks funded by the wealthy tell the poor that poverty is a test of character or a sign of weak faith. Entire communities are convinced that their suffering is either their fault or part of a divine story that will be rewarded in the next life. This belief neutralizes anger, dulls the demand for justice, and leaves billionaires free to hoard wealth without scrutiny. When it comes to war, billionaire involvement becomes even darker. Arms dealers and corporate magnates have long profited from conflict, but with religion as a cover, war takes on a holy dimension. Billionaires fund leaders and movements that frame conflicts as battles between good and evil, faith and unbelief. Ordinary people see war not as the result of political greed, but as divine necessity. And behind the curtain, billionaires count profits from weapon sales, reconstruction contracts, and control over resources. Even in health crises, the influence is devastating. During pandemics, some billionaires backed religious groups that resisted vaccines or spread distrust in science. They did this not because they misunderstood the data, but because they stood to profit from the chaos. Fear and uncertainty keep people dependent on religious institutions funded by the wealthy. And as lives are lost, billionaires present themselves as saviors, offering selective aid while ensuring the deeper systems of inequality remain untouched. These crises also reveal how billionaire-backed religion blocks real solutions. Climate action is slowed because faith communities are told to deny science. Poverty persists because believers are told to pray for blessing instead of demanding justice. Wars continue because conflicts are framed as holy battles. Pandemics drag on because public health measures are undermined by faith-based skepticism. In each case, the billionaire doesn't just benefit from the crisis. They benefit from the religious narrative that prevents people from solving it. The cruelty is that billionaire-funded religion often promises hope while delivering despair. People are told that God will provide, that justice will come in the next life, the suffering's meaningful, but in the meantime, real solutions are blocked and real lives are lost. The billionaire doesn't share in that suffering. They insulate themselves with wealth, while the rest of the world carries the burden of beliefs the billionaire paid to spread. On a global scale, this turns into a pattern of paralysis. Nations fail to act, institutions fail to reform, and communities fail to resist, all because religion, backed by billionaire money, has reshaped the way people interpret crisis itself. Instead of seeing problems as challenges to be solved collectively, they see them as divine tests or signs of prophecy. And in that fatalistic mindset, the billionaire remains untouchable, even holy. This is perhaps the clearest proof of the evil at work. Billionaires could use their resources to address climate change, poverty, war, and disease in rational, effective ways, but instead, they often choose to fund beliefs that guarantee those crises will continue. It's not just negligence, it's strategy. A world in constant turmoil is a world where people cling to faith, and faith tied to billionaire wealth ensures their power never weakens. The psychological and sociological costs of billionaire-driven religion might be the most corrosive of all. These beliefs don't just affect laws or policies, they shape the inner lives of millions of people. They distort how individuals see themselves, how they relate to others, and how societies function at their core. At the individual level, billionaire-backed religion often instills guilt and shame. People are told that their struggles, poverty, illness, failure, are reflections of weak faith or moral failure. Instead of recognizing structural inequality or exploitation, they turn inward, blaming themselves. This guilt keeps people quiet. It drains their energy, prevents collective resistance, and locks them into cycles of self-doubt. A poor person doesn't demand justice from the billionaire. They pray harder, tithe more, and try to fix themselves. Psychologically, this creates a kind of dependency. Faith becomes not just a source of comfort, but a coping mechanism for systemic injustice. The more the system fails, the more people cling to faith, because faith is the only explanation they've been given. Billionaires count on this loop. As long as people believe that their suffering has divine meaning, they won't rise up against the structures causing it. On a community level, billionaire-driven religion creates division. When faith is tied to billionaire agendas, communities are often turned against each other. Believers are encouraged to see outsiders, atheists, other religions, progressive voices, as threats. Instead of uniting around shared struggles, people split into camps of loyalty and suspicion. This division makes collective action nearly impossible. While communities argue over morality, billionaires keep profiting in peace, there's also the erosion of trust. When religious leaders are funded by billionaires, their sermons and teachings inevitably reflect the interests of the wealthy. But ordinary believers don't always see this. They think they're hearing the word of God, when in reality, they're hearing billionaire ideology filtered through a pulpit. Over time, this hollows out trust. When people eventually realize how deeply money shaped their faith, they can feel betrayed and disoriented. Some lose faith entirely, but many simply double down, preferring the comfort of belief to the pain of doubt. Either way, the billionaire's influence lingers. Sociologically, billionaire-shaped religion locks societies into cycles of dependence. Schools, hospitals, charities, and media all funded by religious billionaires, become lifelines for entire populations. But because those institutions are tied to faith, access comes with conditions, education comes with indoctrination, healthcare comes with moral restrictions, charity comes with obedience. People depend on these services, but that dependence ensures they can never step outside the system. It's not real empowerment, it's captivity disguised as care. This cycle also stunts progress. Societies caught in billionaire-driven religion struggle to embrace science, human rights, or democratic reforms. Every step forward is met with a resistance framed in moral terms. A new scientific discovery is labeled heresy. A call for equality is dismissed as rebellion against God's order. A movement for justice is painted as dangerous radicalism. These cultural roadblocks keep societies stuck while billionaires continue to consolidate power. The psychological toll is enormous. Living under systems where wealth is seen as divine blessing creates constant cognitive dissonance. People see the suffering around them, but they're told to interpret it as holy. They feel anger, but they're told anger is sinful. They notice injustice, but they're told justice belongs only to God. Over time, this dissonance leads to resignation. People stop questioning, stop resisting, stop hoping. They retreat into survival and prayer, leaving the billionaires untouched. And yet, the system sustains itself precisely because it offers just enough comfort. Prayer feels meaningful, charity looks generous, cultural stories inspire. These small doses of comfort are enough to keep people from seeing the larger picture, that their lives, their thoughts, even their deepest beliefs have been shaped to serve the interests of the wealthy. This is why billionaire-driven religion is so dangerous. It doesn't only exploit bodies or laws, it colonizes minds. It rewrites morality, identity, and hope itself. And once those inner landscapes are shaped, changing the outer world becomes almost impossible. Perhaps the most chilling part of billionaire-driven religion is how it reaches all the way into death, the afterlife, and ultimate meaning. It doesn't stop at shaping politics, culture, or daily life. It shapes what people believe about their very existence and what happens after it ends. And in doing so, it locks loyalty to inequality until the final breath. The promise of heaven is a powerful tool. When billionaires fund preachers who say wealth on earth is proof of God's blessing, the logic naturally extends to eternity. The poor are told that if they endure faithfully, their reward will come not in this life, but the next. Meanwhile, billionaires are seen as already halfway to heaven, their fortunes treated as visible signs of God's favor. The rich live like saints, and the poor are told to wait patiently for their turn in paradise. The result is a system where no one challenges inequality, because eternity itself has been framed as the solution. This belief has devastating effects. A worker underpaid, a family struggling to survive, a community crushed by injustice. Rather than demanding change, they are told their suffering is holy. Their endurance becomes their virtue. They are promised crowns in heaven if they keep quiet on earth. And that silence is exactly what billionaires need to keep extracting wealth without resistance. Some billionaires fund versions of religion that emphasize eternal punishment. Hell becomes not just a place of sin, but of disobedience. Questioning authority, rebelling against hierarchy, resisting wealth, these can all be framed as paths to damnation. Fear keeps people in line. Even their eternal destiny feels tied to obedience to systems of inequality. To challenge a billionaire can feel in the believer's mind like challenging God himself and risking an eternity of torment. There is also the way billionaires reshape rituals around death. In many faith traditions, funerals, memorials, and religious rites emphasize humility, community, and equality in death. But when billionaires fund these institutions, even death becomes stratified. The wealthy receive elaborate services, monuments, and recognition as holy benefactors. The poor receive only promises. The message is clear. Wealth sanctifies not only life, but death itself. What makes this particularly cruel is that it exploits the most vulnerable moment of all, the fear of death. People cling to faith because it offers hope against the unknown. And billionaires, through funding religious narratives, make sure that hope reinforces obedience to them. If people truly believe their eternal fate depends on loyalty, then resistance becomes unthinkable. Even ideas of resurrection, reincarnation, or cosmic destiny are twisted into this framework. Billionaire wealth is framed as evidence of having lived rightly in past lives, or of being chosen in some grand cosmic plan. Their status becomes untouchable, not just in this life but across all time. The faithful are told that if they want the same destiny, they must obey, trust, and sacrifice. The wheel of inequality spins endlessly, sanctified by beliefs about eternity itself. This manipulation of ultimate meaning also creates despair disguised as hope. People are told not to expect justice here, not to seek fairness now. Their hope is redirected away from earth and into a distant promise. That hope may comfort them individually, but collectively, it paralyzes society. Billionaires benefit most from this diversion because as long as people are waiting for heavenly justice, they'll never demand earthly change. And perhaps the most disturbing part is how billionaires use this framework to absolve themselves. No matter how much exploitation or destruction they cause, they can frame it as irrelevant compared to eternity. They give donations to churches or charities, and suddenly they are remembered not for their greed but for their faithful generosity. Death cleanses their image. They are buried as saints, remembered as benefactors, praised as chosen souls. The world forgets the damage they did because faith has rewritten their story. When religion is shaped by billionaires, even death itself becomes a tool of control. Lives are lived in obedience, deaths are sanctified as loyalty, and eternity is used as a weapon to keep inequality unquestioned. It's a complete system stretching from birth to beyond the grave, and it shows just how far billionaire-backed beliefs can reach. When you look at the full picture, it becomes clear that billionaire-driven religion isn't just about personal faith or private morality. It's a system that stretches across every layer of society: family, culture, politics, economics, psychology, and even ideas of death and eternity. It doesn't just protect wealth, it sanctifies it. It doesn't just excuse inequality, it makes inequality feel holy. The larger consequence is civilizational stagnation. Societies shaped by billionaire-backed religion stop moving forward. They recycle the same stories of obedience, the same promises of future reward, the same excuses for present suffering. Science is stifled, equality is resisted, justice is postponed. People live and die in systems that never change because they've been convinced change is rebellion against God. And in that paralysis, billionaires thrive. This isn't accidental. It's the logical outcome of a system designed to protect wealth at all costs. Religion, when weaponized by billionaires, becomes the perfect form of social control. It reaches into the heart, into the home, into the imagination, into the afterlife itself. No police force or army could achieve that level of influence, but belief can. And with enough money, belief can be directed, curated, and spread until it feels like truth. Breaking free from this system is incredibly difficult, not because the arguments of billionaires are intellectually strong, they're not, but because those arguments are tied to the deepest fears and hopes people hold. Fear of death, desire for meaning, longing for justice. These are not weaknesses, they're part of being human, and billionaires exploit them with precision. When religion is tied to those instincts, rejecting it can feel like rejecting life itself. Yet history shows that no system of control lasts forever. People eventually notice the gap between promises and reality. They see the contradiction between wealthy elites preaching humility and living in luxury. They notice that prayers don't fix poverty, that obedience doesn't end injustice, that charity never replaces equality. Slowly, cracks appear, and once cracks form in belief, even vast fortunes can't seal them. The real danger is that until those cracks widen, billionaires will continue to use religion to fortify their power. They will keep funding churches, schools, charities, and media that sanctify inequality. They will keep reshaping culture, politics, and personal morality. They will keep baptizing their greed in the language of faith. And ordinary people will keep carrying the weight of a system that was never built for them. It's not enough to see billionaires as powerful because of their money. Their true power lies in their ability to rewrite morality itself, to convince millions that their wealth is sacred, their authority divine, their dominance inevitable. That is the evil at the heart of billionaire-backed religion. It takes the most human of instincts, the search for meaning, and turns it into a fortress protecting inequality. But once that is recognized, the spell weakens. The myths of divine wealth, chosen leaders, and holy obedience are not eternal truths. They are inventions funded and amplified by the rich. And if they can be invented, they can also be dismantled. What remains after the myths collapse is the possibility of seeing billionaires not as saints, not as saviors, but as humans, fallible, greedy, and accountable. The question is not whether billionaires will keep trying to use religion to hold power. They will. The question is whether societies will continue to accept those stories or begin to tell new ones. Stories where meaning, justice, and dignity are not dictated by wealth, but shared by all.